Welcome to the latest edition of the Shukri Wrights Podcast with your host, Shukri Wrights. Today is Reunite a Friend Day because although separated by a border that's been man-made and unfortunately in these COVID times that we're living in, my friend and a good friend of mine, Nick Alberga, joins from in Toronto. And last time I spoke to you, we were in the summer. We were in shorts, we're in short sleeves. And here we are in March. We're still in COVID, not in short sleeves. So first and foremost, welcome back, because it's a thrill to have you back on the podcast again. And secondly, goodness grief, can we figure out a better way to just roll out the vaccines and stuff like that? Because seriously, I'm getting irritated.
Yeah, I think we got fatigued, my man. Mad respect for the Blue Jays hat, by the way. It's great to be back with you. And
Thank you.
I guess the positive development, if you will, spring training getting underway. We're both baseball guys, so to get baseball back is a step in the right direction. But you're right. We're talking off air.
Yeah.
It's been just a strange NHL season, but I guess we're getting closer to hope and happiness, right?
Yeah. I mean, at least in Massachusetts, we'll have fans back in the arena, back at the Garden on March 22nd, which is something I'm like, okay, this is a big sign. But
yeah,
my heart goes out to Canada because you can't go to games just yet, and it's like, still, like what's up with that?
Yeah, it's just it's one of those things where it's, a country-wide type of situation where the whole pandemic and just trying to be careful and cautious with the situation. Even from my point of view, covering the Toronto Maple Leafs, it shouldn't, really different and weird. I would say the fact that in the past I've been able to go down to the arena when we have the games on our station and broadcast live from the arena, watch warm up. It's just, very, very different. Certainly even, working alongside, the play-by-play and the color the way we do, and Joe Bowen and Jim Ralph from that point of view, it's just different too, because they call the road games from Toronto as well. But here's hoping we get past this difficult time. And I think you're totally right. At some point in time, maybe, I don't know, who knows, later on this season, Canada will allow fans to come, at least a couple of them into the building, because I think you're right. It just adds a different element to an NHL game, because I don't know about you, watching a lot of this hockey this year, it's missing that intensity that I think a crowd would bring to the game.
Oh, without question, especially when you watch the battle of Alberta between Calgary and Edmonton, and it's like, it's not the same without the fans. Listen, as much as I love Brad Marchand, but I'll be a hypocrite if I said I hated Matthew Tkachuk of the Calgary Flames, because frankly, he is their version of a Brad Marchand. And so I got to ask you this. One of the things that has stood out to me about the Battle of Alberta this season was that it didn't take long before you start to hear the water boil inside the tea kettle. With or without fans, how intense and how quickly does it intensify on the ice between the two teams?
Yeah, they hate each other. You're right. But I think it's a really good point too. I think if you were to toss in 10 games between Calgary and Edmonton and a heated crowd on a Saturday night per se, I just think that the roof would come off. That's to me, if I had to really nitpick on this season, and I get it, these weird times, but having no crowd has just been so different. I think there's a lot of teams, a lot of players, even a Matthew Tkachuk that you brought up, that feed off the energy of a crowd. Role players. The Vegas Golden Knights, I think, are a prime example. They got their crowd back on Tuesday night, and lo and behold, they were down 4-2, came back to win against the Minnesota Wild. I think it really is undervalued in general, not just the Battle of Alberta, but in this league in general, the power of what a crowd can do. And I think a perfect correlation is the NBA, right?
Yes.
Going into the postseason this year in the NBA, I have no clue. I don't think it even matters if you have the number 1 seed or the number 7 or so on and so forth. And I think I'd say the same about the NHL, but we'll see where we're at in terms of a crowd and how many people are in a building in a couple of months from now.
One of the things that I hope for, and you brought up a great point about the importance of the fans and the power of fans, especially in the NHL, it's probably second to none. And like, this is looking across the 31, soon to be 32 teams, which includes the Seattle Kraken when they officially start their first NHL season in this October. And one of the things that I've missed, and I've watched a pretty good amount of Hockey Night in Canada games this season. I miss seeing like the crowded arenas, like for Montreal and Toronto, or whether it be at Scotiabank Arena or at the Bell Center in Provence. I miss that. And one of the things that I think we took for granted was the element of the energy that the fans bring and how it changes and impacts a game. What is something that you absolutely miss the most when it comes to the fans and the energy of the crowds, especially not just only in terms of for Hockey Night in Canada, but just rivalry games, especially when you look at, like, as I mentioned, Toronto, Montreal. For me also, I look at like Ottawa and Toronto, like when you look at those type of matchups and settings.
Yeah, I think it's just the buzz of the crowd, right? Like
Mhm.
I think covering that rivalry the way I have the last couple of years, Toronto, Montreal, you just have that feeling, that buzz. You can say the same thing about Edmonton and Calgary. If you're in the building for one of those type of games, especially on a Saturday night, Hockey Night in Canada,
Yeah.
there's just a stir. There's a buzz. Couple of people having drinks. Everybody's feeling great about life, and you just got that urge to want to watch that hockey game and the intensity to really ramping up. And I think that fuels the players. Quite honestly, if you were to ask a player, the differences in playing without a crowd to having a crowd, it would be night and day. And,
Mhm.
I think, they have to find different ways to get themselves going, if that makes sense. And I think for
Yes.
the most part they have. But again, watching a lot of these games, even the one on Sunday, the Bruins and the New York Rangers, it
Yeah.
sounded like a mausoleum at the Garden. This is
Yeah.
Madison Square Garden, one of the loudest, most storied buildings in the NHL in the world. And I just, you could hear a pin drop fall. And I know the Bruins were all over the New York Rangers on
Mm.
Sunday, but
Yeah.
that's the one thing that I really, really miss. And you're right, taking for granted is the right phrase, because we certainly do right now.
And I miss being at a hockey game like badly, and it just occurred to me, and I want to say this in terms of just looking at it like what perspective.
Mhm.
We are doing this at the beginning of March. This is now March 2nd, the day of recording. We are about to hit the 1 year anniversary when the world shut down, or should I say, at least the US and Canada really shut down in terms of sports and in terms of just the life as we knew it.
Rudy Gobert, shout out to Rudy Gobert.
Oh my God. And it's ironic that a year later he's a candidate to be the NBA Defensive Player of the Year.
Yeah, all they
That's
did was give him a max contract, right? Great
yeah,
stuff.
crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
But like it's crazy to think that a year later here we are.
No,
Here
I
we
know.
are, and
Yeah.
just goodness, like I just miss the energy, especially when you go to a Bruins game, especially if it's Bruins Leafs or especially Bruins Montreal. And it's a shame we won't get to see that this season because of the realignment of the divisions. So I'll ask you this: what are your thoughts on the Scotiabank North Division so far as a whole? Has it exceeded any type of expectation that you may have had going into the season between the teams that are in the division, or has it disappointed you, if at all?
As a one-off, I honestly think it's been phenomenal and fantastic for this country. Going forward, I just don't see it for a variety of reasons. Amongst them being the fact that we're about to be 32 teams in this league, and they want
Yeah.
to split up the teams into 4 equal divisions. That makes sense. There's 7 Canadian teams. You just can't do it, right?
Mhm.
Unless there's like an honorary Canadian team, but I just don't see it.
Yeah.
As a one-off, I think it's fantastic. Financially, I don't think it makes as much sense for for the states. Obviously in Canada, they're thriving, especially without a crowd. I think it's been excellent on a nightly basis to have these all Canadian matchups. But I think on the ice, it's been quite interesting that it seems to be the Toronto Maple Leafs and then everybody else.
Mhm.
As you know, I cover the Maple Leafs. They've been so dominant. 17-4-2 in the first 23 games of the season. The closest team as we speak right now is the Edmonton Oilers, who are 8 points back. Nobody's even in the ballpark of the Toronto Maple Leafs. I think Winnipeg's a team slowly it's trying to figure it out. It's had it the last little while, the Montreal Canadiens have been turbulent up and down. They fire their head coach, a former Bruin head coach, and Claude Julien.
We're going to get to that.
We will. Dominic Ducharme coming in. Like there's a lot of fleas, if that makes sense, in this North Division outside of the Toronto Maple Leafs. I do think the Maple Leafs are for real this season.
One of the things that has stood out to me is the Toronto Maple Leafs this season, 17-4-2, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Going into the season, I said, and I really believed this at the time, and I wasn't sure whether if there was going to be like a realignment of divisions. I said, Toronto, that team is going to be on the lookout, because you go out and you get a Zach Bogosian, you go out and you get a Joe Thornton, you add a Wayne Simmons to that lineup, and you can't sit here and tell me as a hockey fan it doesn't make a world of a difference. So the first question I'll ask you in terms of Maple Leafs is this: what has been the biggest difference between this season's team versus last season's team in terms of the on-ice chemistry and as well as the locker room, the impact of the locker room?
Yeah, undeniably, I think it's been the defense. Another guy they brought in from the Calgary Flames is TJ Brody, but You're right. It seems like everything they've touched has turned to gold. And that includes Michael Hutchinson, who unbelievable, was the fourth string netminder coming into this season, but he's been forced to play. Aaron Dell was picked up off waivers by the New Jersey Devils. Jack Campbell's been backed up. Frederik Andersen's been backed up. And I think that's an astonishing development for me, is the fact that Maple Leafs backups are now 6-1-0 to start this season in 7 starts, which is huge. Again, it's a lot different in Boston with the tandem they have in Tuukka Rask and Yaroslav Halak. But I think when you look at this Maple Leafs team in general, they're playing just so much better in front of their goalies. I think in recent years, they've really, really struggled defensively. A lot of mistakes in their own zone, couldn't get the puck out. And that's been the biggest noticeable difference for me, at least so far through the first 23 games. Granted, it's just the same division. You play the same teams all the time. Is from a defensive point of view, this team is much more locked in. And I think on top of that, as you referenced, the pickups have all proved to play a purpose so far. Wayne Simmons is hurt right now, but I think he's been huge for that power play.
Yeah.
Joe Thornton, just under a point per game, I think has been monumental for that locker room. Ditto for Simmons. Zach Bogosian coming off a Stanley Cup with the Tampa Bay Lightning. It seems like every piece they've picked up has offered something, and I think has made a whole world of a difference so far through 23 games for this team.
When you talk about Jason Spezza, I think he's been one of the more underrated pieces for this team so far. That goal on Saturday night, wicked, eh? Man, listen, I gotta ask you, how in the blue blazing hell did he manage to fake off or deke off the defender and shoot that thing stick wide top shelf corner? Like, how? Like,
it's funny.
Please explain it.
It's funny you say that, because I was sitting with Gord Stellick, my co-host for Leafs Nation coverage, and I called it. I'm like, fake clapper. He's going shelf. If you roll back the tape, he's done this 6, 7, 8 times in his career, and they did last night on the Sportsnet broadcast on TV, recalling all the time Jason Spezza has pulled that move. And it's just one of those things. Like, every player has their patent move. That's Spezza's, and he always seems to get the D going. Always seems to get the goalie off his post, right? It happened to Mike Smith. It's happened to Carey Price, among others. It really is astonishing. But you see Spezza, score goals like that. You're like, wow, this is like 07, 08 Jason Spezza all over again, where he's tearing up the entire National Hockey League. The Fountain of Youth, Shukri, has been a big story for me so far this season. You can find, maybe 1 or 2 guys, vets, if you want to call them, on every team that are exceeding expectations right now. And Joe Thornton's a perfect example. Jason Spezza, Mike Smith, Dustin Brown with the Los Angeles Kings, Joe Pavelski, what he's doing with the Dallas Stars. Like, that's been the biggest story for me, quite honestly. Nobody's really talking about in the NHL so far, is how many of these vets, especially in a season like this, right, where it's just so unconventional. You're not really traveling, normal. You're playing in baseball type series, and these guys have really elevated their play so far, and Spezza's among them for sure.
And one of the things that you mentioned about Joe Pavelski with Dallas, and I think Dallas has been one of those teams, and like, I can't even say in the West because there's no East-West conference this season, but in that division, in which that there has been a number of surprises, Chicago Blackhawks being one of them, because I did not expect them to be in contention at all this season, given that Jonathan Toews hasn't played a single game. He's still out with the illness. And then, as well as, like, by and large part, you look at guys like Murphy and Patrick Kane, who just scored his 400th goal the other night of his illustrious NHL career so far. There's been a long list of surprises, and this is probably going to take multiple segments even to run through them all if possible. So the first surprise I want to address is when you look at the Montreal Canadiens. They get off to such a great start. Everything seemingly going well until it wasn't going that well. And the biggest concern that I've had going into the month of February for me was this. Can Carey Price and Jake Allen hold up as a goaltending duo? And the bigger question was offensively, can they continue to be consistent? And I'll ask you this. What has led, if it's one thing or multiple factors, what has led to Montreal's sudden reversal of fortunes that led to, as you mentioned, Claude Julien's dismissal?
Yeah, well, as we speak right now, they've dropped 5 in a row, which I think is maybe not an indictment fully of how they've played under Dominique Ducharme in 2 games. I thought they really dominated the Winnipeg Jets on Saturday, and again, as we speak right now, they'll play the Ottawa Senators tonight. Maybe that changes, and the fortunes change for this team. But it was just really, really bizarre the way it all came about. Certainly, the start for Claude Julien. I think if you're going to make a change, why not make it after the bubble? Like, to me, it was just weird in general because Montreal was supposed to be in a rebuild. They were supposed to miss the Stanley Cup playoffs. And then because of the new format, because of COVID, they get into a rejigged format where there's 24 teams and they impress. And suddenly there's these lofty expectations. They add some players. I think they had a good off season, but they added guys who are like good, nice players. They're nothing exceptional. Like Josh Anderson's been good. Tyler Toffoli is going to score some goals, but he's also going to be MIA a couple games. Jeff Petry's been a great story this season. They re-signed Gallagher, UFAs to be in Philippe Danault and Tomas Tatar. I think the biggest notable difference from month 1 to month 2 is also defensively and offensively, down a goal per game. I just didn't think it was sustainable to score 4 goals per game the way they did in the first month. And then Carey Price just hasn't been himself, and that's been a familiar theme for a couple of years now. I do think Montreal needs to let go with Tad and give Jake Allen the crease, because I think by far he's been the better goalie. And I just think, every year they seem to owe something to Carey Price, and maybe it's because of that contract, the fact they can't get rid of him right now. But I think you have to go with who can give you the best chance. And right now, for me, that's easily Jake Allen. So I'm curious to see what happens over the next little while for Montreal, because you're right. I was born in Montreal, which a lot of people don't know. I'm not really a Habs fan, but talking to some family members, I was sort of joking how we go from 2 weeks ago, Marc Bergevin's the GM of the year, to now he's on the hot seat, right? And it's pretty crazy. Like, I think even the fact that Dominique Ducharme is just an interim per se just tells you all you need to know about the standing for Marc Bergevin with this team. But it just shows you the expectations in this country. And I think honestly, the worst thing for Montreal to do was have success in that bubble, because now there's unfair expectations, at least in my opinion.
No, there is. And I think one of the things that I looked at, especially when you talk about the bubble, they weren't supposed to beat Pittsburgh.
Exactly.
Come on. Like, if you had the Canadiens at that time beating Pittsburgh in the bubble last summer, I'm calling you a liar, because they caught lightning in a bottle, if you will, and it happened. Now, as you mentioned, the worst thing that happened was, okay, they made the Stanley Cup playoffs because of the COVID and then now the 24 team playoff, or should I say the qualifiers and so forth. Now you look at this team, and as you mentioned, the offseason, you talk about getting guys like Josh Anderson, getting guys such as like brain
Toffoli, Edmondson, you're right.
Yeah, Paulie Anderson, Allen. like Allen, like getting all these guys, and now, wow, this team looks good. And in the first month, I'll be honest, I'm like, impressive. But Carey Price is the guy I keep looking at, and I've been saying this truthfully for 3 years now. Something is not right with Carey Price, because it just seems like there'll be periods in time where he looks absolutely like the NHL MVP, the Hart Trophy winner he was in 2014-15. And then there are times where his game completely just falls off the face of the earth. So my question to you is, why is it that it seems like in Montreal, or it seems like in Canada, that Carey Price is looked as he's an untouchable. You can't speak against him. And I know I'm probably going to get ripped for saying this, but frankly, it's time to stop overrating Carey Price based on what he's done in the past and start looking at him and what he is now.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where they just always write off goalies there. Like I remember 10 years ago, Yaroslav Halak was in Montreal, and they had the magical playoff run. They had they changed the stop signs that say "arrête" in French to Halak. Like everybody was all in on Halak, and they wanted to trade Carey Price, and then the rest was history. I just think it's trying to play with the weight of that contract, and I think players will never admit it, but to have to live up to the expectation of how much Carey Price gets paid, I think is a deterrent, going forward, and certainly this season for that Montreal Canadiens team, more so for Carey Price. To me, it just strikes me as a guy who's just fatigued with that market. It takes the right special human being to play in Canada, especially in Montreal, where you have to not only deal with the English speaking media, but the French speaking media. Like it's not for everybody. And we've seen a bevy of players go through that market and just don't have the same success as they've had in other markets, right? Scott Gomez among them. Like it's just one of those things where it just sometimes just doesn't work out. And I find like Carey Price in Montreal is getting stale. That said, maybe they entice Seattle to take that contract. Who knows? But you're right. Like we're getting at a point in time where, especially in this dead cap era, this flat cap era, whatever you want to call it, to pay your goalie that much money, I just don't know how successful you can be. And I know Tampa took away from that narrative, paying Andre Vasilevsky $9.5 million and winning a Stanley Cup. But I think Tampa's just got so much more depth, stockpiled prospects, and also on the ice than the Montreal Canadiens have. And of course, they got Victor Hedman as well. Like the list goes on with the Lightning. But yeah, you're right. When it comes to Carey Price in Montreal, it is getting stale in a hurry, and I do still again feel Jake Allen should get more starts here.
Yeah, he should. And the thing that I look at, and I look at Montreal, and I look at Toronto, and I look at these two teams. I'm like, this is almost like a day and night comparison, if you will. And if there's a team that I look at in that Canadian division and I say that that's been an absolute shocking of a disappointment, Vancouver, because a lot of it has come from, in my opinion, goaltending. Because at the time when they let Jacob Markstrom go sign with Calgary, that 6-year deal, I thought to myself, I'm concerned. I'm concerned on two fronts. It was first that, and then Chris Tanev going elsewhere. That literally got me. I'm alarmed because I don't like where this is going. Chris Tanev was such an important piece to that team last season, in which that I thought that he was the perfect role player to have on that team. In this season, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. I think it's fair to say that they're missing Chris Tanev. But back to the larger point I was making about the Vancouver Canucks, they go out and they get Braden Holtby for a couple of years. And so far, it's gotten off to a disastrous start. And this team right now is under a lot of scrutiny, and no one knows what the job security status of Travis Green is going to be. So I'll ask you, what exactly is going wrong in Vancouver, given the expectations and the goalie change, and given that a couple of key guys just have not produced up until this point, most notably Bo Horvat, and dare I say, I'll even add in Quinn Hughes up until this point.
Yeah, and firstly, I think you're bang on. The goaltending situation didn't work out the way they would have liked. I did think there was going to be a bit of regression in general with this Vancouver Canucks team. I think Jacob Markstrom masked a lot of what's wrong with the Vancouver Canucks, and that's defensively. They're a gong show, and that continues with or without Chris Tanev, by the way. I didn't think Vancouver had enough depth offensively outside of their top six. If even their top six, maybe their first line is really, really strong. They got some serious questions. I think they're going to make some moves over the next little while. Sounds like Jake Virtanen, maybe even a Tanner Pearson's out the door.
Wow.
It's important to note too with Vancouver, Travis Green's a lame duck coach right now. Doesn't have a new contract following this season. I think Jim Benning is in some hot water as well. But from what I understand, management or, above Benning do like Travis Green and what he brings to that table. So I think the likelier scenario as we speak right now is that it could be Jim Benning. If this doesn't sort itself out for Vancouver, a lot can change in a hurry, especially in this era of 4-point hockey games, playing your division all the time. It can swing quickly, especially look at Montreal, prime example. But I just don't know if the Canucks have enough, I should say. And it's not even about the crease. Like I believe enough in Thatcher Demko. I think Braden Holtby is a good 1B, if you will. The back end's okay, but they can't keep the puck out of the net. And number two, it's just a massive weight for Quinn Hughes and Elias Pettersson. And I did expect some regression with JT Miller. The depth is not there for me for Vancouver. I mean, there's other things to talk about, but that's the big thing and the noticeable thing for me this season.
I thought that the depth was there. Like as you mentioned, like JT Miller, I would expect him to be. I wasn't expecting him to be a top 6 player, but rather be able to chip in at least like 15, 20 goals and so forth. But I also look at guys like you had Tyler Toffoli last season. You acquired him prior to the stoppage of play, and before he signed on the free agent deal with Montreal. Is it fair to say that the scoring depth on that team has regressed from last season to this season, and it's part of the reason why they are having a tough time just being able to keep pace and get themselves out of a deep hole that they've gotten themselves into?
Yeah, like hindsight's 2020. In a perfect world, you re-sign Tyler Toffoli and he adds another piece for you, because I think you're right. Tyler Toffoli, what he brought to the table of Vancouver was fantastic. What he's done for the Montreal Canadiens, even better so far. But again, beyond that, I just think from a defensive standpoint, this team has to rectify something. Even Quinn Hughes, who's had a great offensive start, for the most part, has been a train wreck in his own end, and that's goes across that roster. And that's on the top players, that's on the bottom end players. And, from a depth standpoint, I was talking more about their bottom 6, especially with Tyler Mott now out of the lineup.
How long is he out now?
Indefinitely, they're saying with Mott. Yeah, he got hurt against the Leafs a couple weeks back. But I just think there's a lot of questions to be answered for Vancouver. But I think if there's a division where they can probably squeak in, it's maybe this North Division where, again, every team has its fleas except for the Toronto Maple Leafs right now.
Toronto, Edmonton. And I sigh because there's Toronto and then there's everyone else.
Yeah.
8 points is what separates on the Maple Leafs and the Oilers. But speaking of the Oilers, one of the things that has stood out to me, especially in the last 2 games, the old adage, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. If I, prior to this recording, said that the Maple Leafs were going to shut out the Edmonton Oilers twice, and that Connor McDavid wouldn't even be a factor in either one of these games, I would have said you're out of your mind. Have these 2 games proven to me how much of an improvement they have become, have been making defensively this season as compared to seasons past?
1,000%. And I'll even add another stat to that. The fact that the Maple Leafs have been without Austin Matthews in 3 games this season, all against the Oilers, and they beat them all 3 times.
Wow.
And that's the more crazy part for me, the last 2 games. I understand you shut out Edmonton back-to-back. Toronto scored 9 straight goals now in their last 3 games. But it's more so that Austin Matthews didn't play and other players have elevated themselves in the lineup. But you're right. Like from a defensive standpoint, the fact that it hasn't even been Frederik Andersen, right? It was Jack Campbell on Saturday, 30 saves. Michael Hutchinson, their 4th string to start this season, shuts out Edmonton. I'm more so, I'll give Toronto credit, but I'm also wondering Edmonton, like, what the hell is going on? Watching the last couple of games, man, like, even McDavid and Draisaitl just look like they don't even want to be there. Like
I'm shocked.
Yeah. It's just one of those things where maybe it's just Toronto's done enough to stymie Edmonton and find a way to limit Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. But the more I watch Edmonton, I didn't think they were real 2 weeks ago. I didn't think they were real last week. And that was a team, by the way, coming into this 3-game set with the Maple Leafs that had won 11 of 13 games, right? And for me, it's goaltending. McDavid's going to do his thing. Draisaitl's going to do his thing. But I have minimal faith in Mike Smith, Mikko Koskinen. They've claimed Alex Stalock off waivers from the Minnesota Wild.
Wow.
I just think Edmonton's going to be a buffer team all season long. They'll likely find a way into the Stanley Cup playoffs. And I guess you always have a shot when you have those two players, but there's a lot of holes in that roster, man.
Like, I mean, as you mentioned, like McDavid and Draisaitl, but like, what are you getting from guys like Ethan Bear, for example, or even, you know, like a Darnell Nurse? Like what is he doing on the back end as well? Because I think a lot of it has to come down to how are they defending in front of the net. And what I've noticed, especially in the last two games, I mean, I can't even say that this would be an anomaly, because Toronto offensively, as we know, if not arguably the deepest team in the NHL outside of Tampa Bay. But when you look at Edmonton defensively and some of the issues that they've had, especially in the last couple of games, which leads me to have an air of concern. Do you think this is just a bad mismatch between Edmonton and Edmonton's D against the Toronto Maple Leafs forwards, or do you think that there's a deeper issue involved?
Quite honestly, like I in general, I don't think the Edmonton Oilers have been that bad the last month or so defensively. Like I think Darnell Nurse is having an unbelievable season right now. I think Ethan Bear has taken a step back this season. I think Tyson Barrie, who's known for his point production, as we know in this market here in Toronto, really struggled. Part of the Nazem Kadri deal. Alex Kerfoot also coming to Toronto. I think he's been much improved. I just think Edmonton, number one, doesn't have the depth outside of 29 and 97, and maybe Yamamoto, maybe Nugent Hopkins. Up front, they don't have the depth, and on the back end, they don't have the depth. I think people not talking enough about Oscar Klefbom, what he means to this team. He's been out for this season. It's been utter dissection for some reason or another between the Leafs and the Oilers, especially the last couple games here. And the third of a 3-game set will go tomorrow night in Edmonton. Maybe the Oilers have a retort and a response. But it's just been dissection. Like the Leafs are just so locked in right now. I haven't seen this team play this way in a long time. Just the confidence that's been brewing, even without Austin Matthews, they don't skip a beat. But it just shows you the difference in personnel and roster, and how much better Toronto has been than anybody else in this division. Quite frankly.
Let's look at the East, because the East has, I've said it literally from day one, the East is absolutely murder's row all the way through and through. And what we're seeing now between the Bruins, between the Islanders and the Capitals, and dare I even say the New York Rangers, who have grossly underachieved up until this point so far. I got to ask you this. Why, for the life of me, can't we all just figure out why is it that the Boston Bruins have struggled against the New York Islanders in now 3 games this season, yet they don't seem to struggle against teams like Washington, albeit they had to come back from multi-goal deficit, or even like against the Philadelphia Flyers, for the fact of the matter.
Yeah, I just think, I chalk it up to just having teams you don't match up well against. Like it comes down to players as well. I'm sure Wayne Gretzky, the great one, would tell you there's a couple goalies he just didn't like playing in his career, didn't have success against. I think it falls with every player, and I think every team has a kryptonite. And so far, it seems to be the New York Islanders, right? Like the Islanders, are always an interesting team, especially since Barry Trotz took over there. I think more times than not, you're going to get a competitive, a consistent effort. Yeah, there's always going to be concerns and wonders about their offensive, abilities. I think one game they could have it, one game maybe they don't. They're not known for their offense; they're known for their defense. And I think their attention to detail is bar none some of the best in the league. They always come in with a game plan, and they always seem to hit that game plan. And I think if teams are not ready, which Boston seems to not be sometimes against the New York Islanders, they get hit and hit hard, right? Granted, in this season, there's a lot of opportunities to rectify your issues against a team playing them 8, 9, 10 times the way teams are this year. So I think it's a silver lining for the Boston Bruins. I think you're right when it comes to that East Division, that there's a clump of teams, Philadelphia I would include, that's had a so-so start, especially Carter Hart, and they're still involved in that conversation. My curiosity in that division is the Pittsburgh Penguins, who are getting set to score off in the Battle of Pennsylvania in a massive series with their rivals, the Philadelphia Flyers, to see where they truly stack. But I think these 5 teams, Washington, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, it's playing out exactly how I thought it would play out. And I think 4 of those 5 clearly are going to make it. And we haven't even talked about the Buffalo Sabres yet, right?
No, not yet. Which is, because it's interesting, because I actually, true story, did a segment about a rumor that was reported by Fluto Shinzawa, Bruins reporter, insider for the Athletic, about Jack Eichel. And listen, and I said it verbatim, and I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on this. Jack Eichel's not happy in Buffalo. Since he's been drafted by Buffalo in 2015, he has made the Stanley Cup playoffs exactly zero times.
Yeah.
And you'd think that going out and getting a guy like Taylor Hall would at least help, and having the so-called help, which really has been almost non-existent so far this season for the Sabres, would be the big difference. But again, a team that's struggling yet again to keep afloat in what is, as I mentioned, murder's row in the Eastern Division. So I'll ask you, if there is a team out there that's willing to knock on the door of Buffalo and say, hey, we know that you're struggling. We know that you may not make the playoffs. Are you going to sell? And if so, is Jack Eichel available? Which team do you think is going to be one of those teams that goes out and say, maybe we can go after a guy like Jack Eichel?
Well, I think it'd be foolish if not every team reached out outside of maybe the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Edmonton Oilers, like teams that don't make sense completely. Like it's Jack Eichel, right? Players like this don't become the Leafs should get Jack Eichel. No, like players like this are just don't come around very often, right? Like I think you even look at that East Division. I know there's been correlation to Boston and that whole thing, but I just don't think Boston has the assets, right? Like you're looking at McAvoy, you're looking at Beecher. I know they're going to free up cap with David Krejci coming off the books this season, and Tuukka, Yaroslav. Like, there's going to be money available, but I think they have to reallocate that money, especially with Marchand and Bergeron getting older. You have to make some decisions, some hard decisions right now in Boston. I think if you were to ask me, and from my intel, it sounds like the New York Rangers poked around last summer. Capo Caco reportedly could have been part of some offer. I think the Rangers, to me, at least in the Eastern Conference, if you want to call it that, make a lot of sense. I think they have a lot of assets they've stockpiled. Clearly, I think they're a team on the upswing. You got Artemi Panarin. You wonder if Mika Zibanejad would have to be involved. Capo Caco, Alexis Lafreniere. There's just Fox on the back end. Like there's a lot of chips that I think the Rangers could use to land a Jack Eichel. And from all reports, it sounds like New York would deeply be involved in that situation. Montreal is another team that comes to mind. I think they got some prospects that would entice the Buffalo Sabres, but do you really want to make a move within your division and see Jack Eichel every season is my question. GMs will never admit it, but I think sometimes it makes the most sense to move them to the other conference. And again, you're going to find your best deal and make that deal. Clearly in the Western Conference, I think never sleep on a team like Colorado, never sleep on a team like San Jose.
Yeah.
The Nashville Predators are a team thinking about it right now. They need a big time move. And I don't know if they have the assets. I know they have a Dante Fabro on the back end. They have a Matthias Ekholm. You have a Philip Forsberg. I think if I were to look on paper right now and suggest maybe a logical move that makes sense, I think those, if you were to ask me, those are the two teams that make sense right now. The New York Rangers and the Nashville Predators, for that matter.
The New York Rangers, I'm not so sure because you mentioned about Adam Fox. Like Adam Fox is arguably the best young defenseman on that team right now. Mm-hmm. And if you told me maybe Keandre Miller, like, yeah, I'll give you that. But I'll even go as far as to say, if you're the New York Rangers, goodness grief, the options. Can you start with Mika Zibanejad? I mean, who would want to make a move for Mika Zibanejad right now? Because his downfall offensively has been absolutely nothing less than stunning. Considering that last season, coming off scoring 41 goals, and even the seasons prior, he's always been a consistent 30-goal scorer. But this season, for some reason, he can't buy a goal to save his life.
Yeah, he's been snake bit. But again, I'm just tempering my expectations with this season. It's just so weird. These guys are throwing off their schedules. I'm not making excuses as to why people are struggling. But I think there just have been different scenarios for different people and how they've handled COVID. Adam Henrique's another prime example in Anaheim, had 26 goals last year, healthy scratch, put on waivers. Like, we don't know internally what these guys are dealing with, not only in the locker room, going to the rink with their families. Like, this is a heavy, heavy time. And I understand sports, in general, takes our mind off, the ongoing pandemic in this world. But I think it's important we humanize the situation. That's why normally somebody on social media who likes to rip on players more than most people, just because it's fun, they're millionaires and whatever. I'm just being a bit more cautious this season because I think it's so fair to humanize the situation right now because it's just such a heavy time. Like
Yeah.
it just who knows what people are going through right now, right? And I'm not making excuses for Zibanejad. I think he's been dreadful and he needs to be better. But the Rangers as a whole, I expected some regression, especially in that division. You know this with your team, the Bruins being in that division. Every night's difficult, right? And
Mhm.
that includes playing the Devils, who have been a nice story. The Pittsburgh. Like there's just so many strong teams, right? So I'm going to give Zibanejad the benefit of the doubt. I know it's been disappointing so far.
One of the things that you mentioned about is like humanizing like players and so forth.
Yeah.
And I think people should do that a lot more often because you look at listen, I can speak for me personally and being really candid right here and saying this pandemic at times has not been easy for me. I mean, and I mean, I'm not an NHL player, but I don't think you have to be an NHL player to understand that, or even a professional athlete to understand that this pandemic, in which we've been in for inching towards a year now,
10
has
years.
not been easy at all. And one of the
Yeah.
things that has stood out to me, especially when you talk about the NHL season as a whole, is that there have been some really interesting stories and developments in the league. And I want to go out west because there's two teams that come out. No, that stands out to me. And that's the Colorado Avalanche and the Vegas Golden Knights. And I look at both teams and I say, man, I like Colorado tonight. I like their chances to get into the finals. But then there's Vegas. It's like I'm here. Uh, so like I'm really I got my hands tied right now. If I had to pick between Colorado and Vegas to make a run for the cup this year, given that listen, Colorado's deep offensively. I mean, we obviously know about Nathan McKinnon,
Yeah.
Gabriel Landeskog, Mikko Rantanen, Kadri, and so forth. And then you talk about the defense like Samuel Girard, and you look at Golden Knights, and you look at Pietrangelo, the big free agent signing, and their goaltending. I mean, you talk about guys who continue to drink from the fountain of youth.
Mm,
Marc-Andre Fleury, how the hell is he
exactly.
still a damn terrific number one
Stud.
goaltender? Like,
Yeah.
explain that.
You're right. Like Fleury's just he's so mystifying, man. Like even going into this season, what he had to deal with. Robert Leonard gets the contract. They anointed him the number one, and now Fleury's the number one again.
Mhm.
I think in general, you look at that West Division. We're not even at the midway point of this season, right? Colorado has struggled by their standards. I think they'll get it in gear, get it in line. I'm more curious come playoff time. To me, I think there's three locks in that division: Vegas, St. Louis, and Colorado. They're all going
Mhm.
to get in. Minnesota's been a great story. LA, Arizona, San Jose, Anaheim, those teams, they're finished, in my opinion, at least.
Mhm.
But I just think it's one of those things where I can't make a, I can't check the barometer this quickly and say, hey, this team is legitimate. This is not. I think those three teams are legit in the West. I think they all have a capable shot and a good shot at winning the Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
But the team, I guess, if you were to ask me, that stands out is the Vegas Golden Knights. I like their depth. They got two number one defensemen, in my opinion, in Shea Theodore and Alex Pietrangelo.
Mhm.
Solidified in between the pipes, of course. They need Leonard to be better. He's hurt right now, but Marc-Andre Fleury's been great. And up front, I like them as well. I'm wondering if maybe they pick up another piece up front, and I think they're really a legitimate contender if that happens because Mark Stone's all world, Max Pacioretty's fantastic, Jonathan Marchessault. I think they want a bit more out of William Karlsson
Yeah.
and Riley Smith, but I think there's some serious depth in Vegas. So to answer your question, I like that team the most of those three, but I think all those three are viable candidates to win the cup this year.
Can we at least talk about just how good of a player Mark Stone is? Because I think maybe prior to last season, we didn't really appreciate what Mark Stone has been bringing throughout his entire NHL career, even going back to when he was in Ottawa prior to the trade with the Vegas Golden Knights.
Hmm.
Are we finally, as I'm talking about, as a collective NHL fan base, beginning to realize just how good of an all-around player that he is, both offensively and defensively?
Yeah, I think so, but I think it helps with him being in a different market, not Ottawa. Like in Canada, we've known this for a while. Watching him play with
Mm.
the Ottawa Senators, seeing what they gave up, to get him in Vegas. But I think, I guess, specifically in the United States, it's been great to see, the boom, if you will, on Mark Stone. I just think both sides of the puck, as you referenced, right? Like he consistently leads the NHL in takeaways every year, which is a very underrated stat. You clearly
Mhm.
want the puck as opposed to chasing the puck, and if you excel at taking the puck away from somebody, that's a really, really good quality. He's the captain of the Golden Knights. He'll provide offensively, has one of the more stealth releases in the game, one of the better finishers in the game. He is an all world player. And again, Vegas did an excellent job of identifying the player they wanted, brought him in, made a pretty decent trade. I know Eric Branstrom was the big prospect going over. He's been so early on in his career right now with the Ottawa Senators, but I think all in all, they just have to be through the moon and through the roof with how happy they are with Mark Stone in Vegas. He's been awesome this year, I find.
Like, would you say that he would be one of the top candidates for the Hart Trophy this season if all plays out?
I don't know. I think the Hart Trophy is going through Canada. I just think,
Oh,
yeah, I just think the way Connor McDavid's played, the way Leon Draisaitl's played, Austin Matthews, Patrick Kane will be in that conversation. I still wonder. Like Dallas has like a billion games to make up.
oh yeah.
Chicago's doing well right now, but they can easily fall off a cliff in the second half, right? I think Kane's in that conversation. Like, there's a lot of racetrack left. So if you're to ask me right now, I think the Hart Trophy is likely to go through Canada still.
As you mentioned, Austin Matthews, and at one point, and probably now, it's still that point, he's still looked at as a guy like maybe he could score 50 goals in 50
Yeah,
games. Like,
yeah.
I mean, and then you mentioned like Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, in the Scotiabank North Division. If you had to pick between those three guys, and let's say you're Seattle, you had to pick
Yeah.
between either any of those three guys to start your team with, which one would you pick between Austin Matthews, Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl? Which one are you picking and why?
I'll throw a Mitch Marner in too because I think he
Mitch
he
Marner too,
deserves
yeah.
hard consideration. He's been awesome. It's an easy answer. It's not even close. It's Connor McDavid. This guy, like, there's Connor McDavid and then everybody else in this league. And
Mm.
I don't. Everybody's seen the guy play. There's not much more to say about Connor McDavid. He is truly in a league of his own, and I felt that way since he entered this league. And the crazy thing is, he's just going to continue to get better and better, right? Like he's still pretty early on in his NHL
23.
career, which is
Mm-hmm.
it's frightening, right? So yeah, easy answer. It's Connor McDavid for me, man.
You look at Seattle, the Seattle Kraken, because there's going to be a lot of really fascinating talk come July once the Stanley Cup Finals conclude. The NHL offseason doesn't even begin. I don't even think this summer will be even an offseason because
Mhm.
you have the expansion draft, that you have the NHL draft, and you're Seattle. You're saying to yourself, where do we begin? And you're looking at guys who could potentially be exposed for the expansion draft. What are your early prognostications in terms of who Seattle could be eyeing for the expansion draft to play for the Seattle Kraken to open their season in October?
Yeah, they're in the driver's seat, and it's funny you bring this up. I was talking to somebody in Seattle the other night, talking about the very same thing about the expansion draft and where things may lie. The Vegas Golden Knights, how much success they had in their expansion process, but to be curious to see because you can't scout like you did in the Vegas year, right? Because of
Mm-hmm.
the pandemic, and it's harder to travel at least here in Canada than it is in the United States. So I'm sure they're not traveling as much to see players, but I think you have to watch things unravel and go from there. Like prime example is the Columbus Blue Jackets and their goaltending situation. They're off to a so-so start. Jonas Corposalo, Elvis Merzlikins. I think if you're to prognosticate before the season, probably a good bet that one of those two guys would end up with the Seattle Kraken. I'm always curious too with Ron Francis, the GM of Seattle, has an illustrious history drafting defensemen.
Yeah.
What Seattle opts and elects to do when it comes to the expansion process? Do they go heavy like Vegas did when it comes to defenders? I wonder. Dougie Hamilton's a free agent. I wonder. They have all their chips in play right now. I'm sure they're brainstorming as we speak, quite frankly, to figure out what the best route is for this roster. But I think they will find some gems. And I think the other thing that will benefit Seattle in the long run is the cap situation, right? It's a
Yeah.
flat cap world. I think there's a lot of teams, more than we know right now, will look to shed salary in the offseason, which could benefit Seattle greatly as they put together this roster. So that could give them a head start too, to maybe get a prolific player they didn't think they would get. Who knows? Maybe Jack Eichel. Like very interesting, and interested to see how Seattle attacks this whole process, because it's very uncanny. Number one, and number two, it's just going to be so different than it was for the Vegas Golden Knights for a variety of reasons, right?
And you made a really great point about how different it is going to be, because I think when we look back on it now, let's rewind our mental clocks to summer or even spring 2017. Everything is all right in the world in terms of being able to travel freely. You can go to the different games and do your scouting, do your prep work and so forth. Seattle, and I think one of the challenges that general manager Ron Francis is going to have is the limitations, because as you mentioned, we're all still in COVID right now. And what can you do in terms of scouting? What can you do in terms of meetings? Meetings are done virtually and so forth. And which leads me to wonder, is it fair to think that they may not have the same success that Vegas had in 2017-18? And I know it's a very high barometer to use, because all that team did was go to the Stanley Cup Finals. No big deal, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Like, and I think that's the consensus I gather from that market. Like, it's fun to be compared to the Vegas Golden Knights, but you want to be your own entity. I think there's a lot to gather from Vegas and what made that team successful. You take that and you move that over to Seattle. But I just think that's the one thing I would hammer home right away if I'm ownership there, is saying, we want to win, but we have to be realistic. Like, what happened with Vegas is once in a blue moon, honestly, even thinking back. And that team is a juggernaut right off the bat.
Yeah.
But in that conversation, like, I think you can pull a lot from, what they did there. George McPhee, who was the GM at the time, what he did there to put this roster together, and take what you learned there and utilize it to your advantage, right? Manipulating the cap, manipulating teams who need to get rid of salary, making teams, take on and give up draft picks for the betterment of their organization, to keep you away from selecting a player. I just wonder if teams conversely will be smarter this time than they were with Vegas, just with the bonehead moves. And there was a bevy of them, a plethora of them that just set teams back. Like, it's really, really crazy. So you're right. I'm very intrigued with what Seattle has in mind. But again, I think they're big brothers watching, and I'll say that.
Oh, without question. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, especially like given like the process now and what the uncertainty will be in terms of the NHL offseason as to if the cap will even go up or whether it remain the same and so forth. Yeah. But I want to turn our attention to Pittsburgh, because your colleague Brian Burke just left Sportsnet to take the job as president of hockey operations for the Pittsburgh Penguins. And there's already a sense of, I would say, curiosity. I wouldn't even say concern, but more of curiosity more than anything else, because the Penguins are in a very interesting spot in terms of where they are as a franchise, not just solely based on this season, but as a franchise. Crosby, he's going to be 34 years old. Malkin, he's getting up there. He's going to be he's 33 now, but he's getting up there in age and so forth. And then you throw in Chris Letang as well. So the question that I would pose to both to both Brian Burke and the general manager Ron Hextall is, when you attack the offseason that's coming up and you have a decision to make, what do you do and what should you do in regards to one Sidney Crosby? Because let's face it, you are officially at a crossroads where Crosby is getting up there in age. We're not taking anything away from what he is doing this season or even in years past. But the reality is Pittsburgh is in a position where they may be approaching a rebuild. So my question to you is, if you're Brian Burke, if you're Ron Hextall, what decision do you make in regards to the big three in Pittsburgh?
So regards to Crosby, I think the only way Crosby doesn't finish his career with the Pittsburgh Penguins is if Sidney Crosby doesn't want to finish his career with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Knowing what I do about Brian Burke, recently reading his book, he's infatuated. He loves Sidney Crosby, and I get it. So, and the loyalty factor too with Brian Burke. I think on a yearly basis, he'll make sure his team is competitive enough to win with Sidney Crosby. So I don't think it's realistic Sidney Crosby's going anywhere. I think you're onto something with Evgeny Malkin. You're onto something with Chris Letang. I think you look at this roster, there are some flaws, there are some holes, and the only way to rectify those situations is to get rid of cap and reallocate that money. And honestly, if it means Geno Malkin, what he's meant to that organization, that team, I think you have to look at it. And Chris Letang too, right, is a guy who's oft injured, but when he's healthy, he's one of the better defensemen in this league. So I think right now what's happening is Berkey and Hextall are surveying the situation. Pretty much what most bosses do or should do coming into a new setting is really analyzing, sitting down and watching, and then after making adjustments in the approach and what they see fit. So that's my expectation. I'm curious to see what Pittsburgh does between now and April 12th, the NHL trade deadline. And then after that in the offseason, if it doesn't go the way they think it should go there, I think they're probably prone to make at least one big time move, and it's likely going to involve Malkin or Chris Letang. I think you're onto something for sure.
Let's look at the teams down south, or should I say in the central, air quotes.
Yeah.
And because one of the things that I personally cannot wrap my mind around for the life of me is that the Tampa Bay Lightning, they are the defending Stanley Cup champions. And call me crazy, but it just seems like in a way they're like the silent shark that's just lurking, because all they've done is just absolutely play lights out. And considering that right now they're a point behind the Florida Panthers, considering a variety of factors, none more important to me than you look at what they've been able to do as a unit in terms of just offensively, and even in terms of the goaltending. Let's be honest. Did I expect one former Columbus Blue Jackets goaltender to be able to bounce back and at least be a factor as to why the Panthers have been so successful, while Tampa Bay, listen, they're still the class of the NHL. I mean, that it's very difficult to not look at the standings and see Florida is in first place. I'm surprised.
Yeah, I do think the cream is going to rise to the top. I'm taking nothing away from Florida. I think they've been a great story, but Bobrovsky's been okay. Chris Drieger's been the guy for me. He's in a contract year, by the way, who's their 1B, if you want to call him that, in between the pipes. They're much improved defensively, we'll say that. But I do think there are some holes still, and with most teams there are. I think Tampa's the best team by far in that division. I do think the cream will rise to the top. I think Vasilevsky's on pace to win another Vezina Trophy. I think he's been tremendous. 2 shutouts last week. I think Carolina's a really, really strong team. We saw what they did to to the Florida Panthers on Tuesday night, scoring late, then winning it in OT, and an excellent pass by Sebastian Aho. I got my wonders about Chicago. I know they're in a playoff spot right now. I think Columbus will get better, and the team to watch for in that central, in air quotes, is the Dallas Stars, right? They got crazy amount of games in hand on everybody, like 6, 7. So, it's one thing to have those games in hand. It's another thing to take care of those games in hand. So that's probably the team I have circled in that central. They were in the Stanley Cup final last year against the aforementioned Tampa Bay Lightning. I think they're a pretty good team, but again, it's going to be difficult to play that much hockey over this little period of time over the next couple months. But Dallas is a team I'm watching, and I think Tampa's the best team in that division.
Like, Dallas has got some serious ground to make up. They've only played 16 games, while everyone else in the division has played minimum 21 games or more. So as you mentioned, they've got games to make up. So the question that I would have is I would think that a lot of these games are being backloaded, especially towards the final month or so of the regular season. So one of the things I want to ask in terms of the next division I want to look at is the Honda West. So we talked about Vegas, we talked about St. Louis, but there's something about St. Louis that has me a bit concerned. For the love of God, can someone please tell me what the hell did we watch with Jordan Binnington the other night? Because Jordan Binnington, listen, I get that he had the swag, and I'm bitter about 2019 still. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. I'm still very bitter about it. But he had the swag 2 years ago when he took over the starting job. But this season, he's been very inconsistent at times. And I wonder what's the deal with the situation with the goaltending in St. Louis and the episode that Jordan Binnington had the other night.
Yeah, I think the right word I would use for Binnington is pedestrian. I don't have anything against emotion, raw emotion, if you will. I think it was the heat of the moment. He was fired up. He got lit up in that game against San Jose, and he blew a gasket. And I don't know if it's wise to go after 6'5" Devin Dubnyk or try to fake punch Erik Karlsson or try to fight an entire bench, but so be it. And I looked at it almost as a galvanizing moment, right? St. Louis comes back and wins that hockey game. It's to me, it was the same thing as a player fighting and igniting a roster. And I do agree. I think Binnington has to be better, but I think it's important to note with the St. Louis Blues, they're just so banged up, right? Like they're losing man games on a nightly basis, and half the roster is out, and they're still in a playoff spot. Granted, the teams around them do have games in hand. Torrey Krug, I think there was always going to be an adjustment period. You lose your captain, Alex Pietrangelo. Vladimir Tarasenko is on the mend, so that's a positive for that team. Jaden Schwartz is out of the lineup. But there's so many guys going in and out of the lineup. I think Jordan Kyrou been a great story this season. Robert Thomas is out. I think I can't make a proper assessment of St. Louis until they get healthy or close to full health, because there's just so many guys out of that lineup right now. And that's, to me, it's a big contributing factor as to why they've struggled to start this season.
Do you think guys like Zach Sanford and players like him will have to play a bigger role in terms of making sure that St. Louis is able to stay afloat in that division?
Yeah, I don't think there's an issue. Like I don't, if I'm St. Louis, I'm not scared about LA. I'm not scared about Arizona. San Jose, Anaheim. I think Minnesota's a cheeky team this year, but I think they're just riding a hot streak right now, quite frankly. I think St. Louis has enough talent, even with guys not in the lineup. Ryan O'Reilly, David Perron, Braden Shen. I know Parayko's out. That's a big time loss as well. You talk about the back end, and it's so easy to pinpoint and say, hey, the goaltender's the issue. And I agree. Like Binnington hasn't been good, and the back of Ville Husso has been terrible. That was a big concern for me as to how they came with that goalie tandem and Jake Allen. They make the trade, but they didn't get somebody to back up. I don't think Ville Husso is ready, and I think we're seeing that so far this season. So, yeah, there's more holes than we thought with St. Louis, but I think I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. A, because they won a couple of years ago, a lot of the players are still in that roster. B, they lost their captain and Alex Pietrangelo, and that's a big moment for any organization, especially a captain that wins the cup for you. And there's going to be an adjustment period with Torrey Krug, and C, just the injuries. So there you have it.
Like for sure. Like, now, one of the things that we talked about the Rangers earlier in this podcast, Philip Hedl's returning.
Yeah.
Against the Sabres. And in the season in which that a lot more was expected from the New York Rangers, as we talked about, they have grossly underachieved for a variety of reasons. What is the expectation in terms of Philip Hedl being able to be a spark, if at all, for the New York Rangers to finally get going? Because let's face it, they're behind teams like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia in the Eastern Division, which that they need points, and they need points fast.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the Rangers are done. I
was trying to give hope to the Ranger fan base.
I cover fantasy hockey. I was adamant on NHL Network Radio. I did a bunch of hits of Boomer. I'm staying away from the Rangers. I don't think they're real. I think there's going to be growing pains. The way I slot it last year, they were the hunter. Now they're the hunted, right? Igor Shesterkin comes from the minors. Like, teams are no longer sleeping on the New York Rangers. And I think that's part and parcel why they're being dissected this year. Not to mention, again, that's a tough division. You look at teams in recent memory that had success in this league: Washington, Boston, Pittsburgh, the Islanders, Philadelphia. New Jersey's played teams strong so far this season. From the beginning, I just didn't like the slotting of the New York Rangers. I just think it was going to be very, very difficult to win hockey games and be competitive in that division. And I think there's going to be growing pains across that roster. Includes Alexis Lafreniere, Capo Caco. We're seeing with Mika Zibanejad. Jacob Trouba's out right now. Adam Fox, the whole D'Angelo situation. Like, it's just been a nightmare start. Not to mention what's happening with Artemi Panarin right now too.
How much of a factor is the Artemi Panarin situation impacting the New York Rangers, considering the allegations that came from Russia? And I mean, Panarin is away from the team right now as he deals with that situation and so forth. How much of a dark cloud is this hanging over the Rangers organization, and how much has it impacted them on the ice?
Yeah, I don't know how much of it's a dark cloud. I think it's just more so adding to the season that just nothing's been aligning, right? You look conversely last year where everything aligned for the New York Rangers, and they were just a magical story. I thought they were really humbled in the bubble by the Carolina Hurricanes and brought back to reality, and that's transferred and carried over to this season. I think there's holes. I think Panarin, there was just no way he was going to match the season he had last year. Artemi Panarin is out of this world. He was a Hart Trophy candidate, and I just think it stings sometimes as a fan base to get some humble pie, but that's what's happening to the New York Rangers this season. I think goaltending too, like Georgiev and Shesterkin, it's going to take some time. And moving on from Henrik Lundqvist, like there's a lot of intangibles and variables that people don't comprehend or realize. But I think what we're seeing right now is a perfect example of growing pains for a young team that's going to be good down the road.
Now, going back to the North Division, would you consider Sheldon Keefe to be an early candidate for the Jack Adams Award?
I think he has to be. It's going to be so. I don't envy voters. I should say that. Like, I don't envy people who have to vote for these major awards.
Would you ever vote for these awards?
Well, I'm not in the PHWA, so no, I wouldn't have standing for that. For the most part, But I just think it's so hard to quantify. Like, how do you say, Sheldon Keefe's the best coach when you look at, the job Peter Laviolette, for instance, has done with the Washington Capitals? Half their rosters had COVID. Like, they've been missing half their team the whole year, and yet they remain in first in that East Division. Like, there's just so many tremendous stories, and I just wonder, how many percentage of the voters will come from Canada as opposed to the States? Because no doubt people watching hockey in this country will more so favor Sheldon Keefe, the hockey mecca in Toronto. So I think it's going to have an impact. And I think if things continue to trend and the Maple Leafs continue to dominate the way they are, I think, to answer your question, he will be involved in the conversation. And I'm taking nothing away from Sheldon Keefe. He's been excellent. That team's been great, but it's tough to quantify for me because that North Division, I think, quite frankly, in my opinion, is the weakest division of the four in this league right now.
Last question. You talk about Toronto and the start that they've gotten off to earlier in this podcast.
Yeah.
The question I want to ask you is, if this team is to make a run for the Stanley Cup this season, given the start that they've gotten off to, what's the number one area that you feel that the Maple Leafs will need to address at the trading deadline to make that push for the Stanley Cup?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And I asked Chris Johnston of Hockey Night in Canada last night on the show, was like, when you're winning this much and having this much success, like, how do you figure out what your team needs, right? And I think it's been no secret Toronto is searching for a top six winger to play with John Tavares and William Nylander, who that line just hasn't gotten going. And funny enough, with Austin Matthews out, it's been Mitch Marner on a line with John Tavares and Joe Thornton, and they've been rather effective 5-on-5. So I think that's what they'll be searching for and will continue to do so. I know they've been linked to Michael Granlund with the Nashville Predators. I think Toronto's going to poke around, but it's got to be money in, money out. In this cap world, especially a team as close to the cap as the Toronto Maple Leafs are, it's going to have to be an interesting move, and maybe the team that you make a deal with is going to have to eat a lot of money in a contract to make it work. But I think if I'm the Leafs, I'm looking a top six winger, if I can get my hands on one. And number two, you can never have enough depth on the back end. They have probably 7, maybe 8 if you add Rasmus Sandin as 8 competent defensemen that you'd feel okay enough, comfortable enough playing in the Stanley Cup playoffs. But I'd add at least one more guy on the back end too.
Nick Alberga of Sportsnet 590 The Fan, Sportsnet, and Sirius NHL XM. Dude, it's whatever you do, please. Just keep your sanity by continuing to watch hockey. And if you can, maybe get some poutine delivered to your house.
Ooh, okay. I like that sound.
And what you're also going to like the sound of this, because I have been itching to actually make a trip up to Toronto when the border reopens. And I'm like, okay, let's go. I'm ready. Like, but when I finally do, I am going to hit you up, and we're definitely going to link. You have my word on that, because I've been dying to visit Toronto for the longest, and that's like the first city I actually want to go visit once the border reopens, and we can actually socialize as regular human beings once again.
Sounds fantastic. I can't wait for the year 2035, my man.
Good grief, man. I don't know if I can wait 14 years, eh?
Seriously, it feels that way though. Is this thing over yet? Are we still locked down? Are we still in quarantine?
Seriously, oh my God! Like
the way I'm watching Love Island UK right now.
Huh?
I'm watching Love Island UK right now. That's the level of craziness I'm at.
That says an awful lot, my man.
Exactly. Don't tell anybody, okay?
I won't tell anybody. All right, my pleasure, buddy. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you. Take care.